we shouldn't be taxing the poor to pay for handouts for the rich. There is this extremely powerful apparatus of lobbying firms, comms agencies, powerful firms that have the ear of this government. It's very easy for some people to get a meeting with Rachel Reeves. If you're the CBI or a representative of a big bank or a fossil fuel company, there's recent research showing that the fossil fuel companies had 500 meetings with the Labour Party in recent years. So I am an author, and my most recent book, Vulture Capitalism, is available in all good bookstores.
So yesterday was the budget, and just wondering your kind of immediate reaction to who the winners and losers of that budget were.
So in some senses, the left is a bit of a winner from this budget, not because we've seen anything substantial really delivered in terms of what we've been demanding for a while, but simply because Rachel Reeves felt it necessary to concede some ground in areas that she's been holding out on for a very long time. So I'm thinking particularly about wealth taxation here. We've obviously got the council tax surcharge on homes worth over £2 million, and raising tax rates on income from other forms of wealth, like dividends, for example, and rental income. So that shows how much parties like the Greens and also, campaigners from within her own party have pushed the dial on that issue. Same goes for the two-child benefit cap. This was a huge thing that particularly Labour backbenchers were campaigning on, but also the Greens and other kind of left voices were really pushing her to abandon it, because it was just, having such a disastrous impact on children all across the country and really embedding poverty. So there are, some positive signs there. There are also, if you look at the papers now, rich people are pretty angry for a whole number of reasons, both because of those forms of tax on wealth and also things like, for example, introducing a change in the way that pensions contributions are taxed, which is going to again have more of an impact on wealthy people. And also the biggest thing, which I think everyone has kind of focused on the most, is the freeze to the income tax thresholds. Now, what that means is that because inflation is going up, prices everywhere are going up, probably alongside that, your wages will be going up somewhat. It basically means that everyone gets dragged into a higher tax band. So for kind of middle earners, more of them are going to be in the higher rate tax band. And also a lot of people, I think it's nearly 800,000 people are being pulled into paying tax altogether. That's very, very poor people on incomes of around 13, 14, 15,000 pounds suddenly having to pay tax, income tax, which is again, going to have a really big impact on some families. So she's managed to simultaneously give in to the left on a number of points, whilst also just making everyone else really angry and not particularly pleasing many of those constituencies that would have liked her to go a bit further on wealth taxation, which is, I think, why people have kind of greeted this budget pretty grimly.
You mentioned a lot of stuff there that I really want to dig into, especially that income tax threshold freeze. But first, I want to talk about the Greens, who you mentioned there. I wondered if you could speak a little bit more about sort of Zach Klansky's influence on this budget, but also if you think Rachel Reeves's concessions on things like a mansion tax have been enough to stop votes being lost from Labour to parties on the left.
Yeah, absolutely not. This is not going to do anything really to stem the kind of flow of support out of Labour and towards the Greens on the left. I mean, there are a few reasons for that. First and foremost, a lot of those votes were lost, as soon as Keir Starmer said, Israel has the right to cut off water and power to Gaza years ago now. People were kind of, really, really angry at that apparent support for genocide and war crimes. And that's only continued as Labour kind of bedded in on that issue. So there's the votes that were lost over Gaza, they're just not coming back, because that, for some, including me, including a lot of people, is just a really defining issue of our times. Then when it comes to wealth taxation itself, this is something the left has been pushing for a while. It's something that particular voices have gained extraordinary popularity pushing for, particularly particularly people like Gary Stevenson, for example, who just blew up talking about the need for wealth taxes. And, this is something, again, that the Greens have been campaigning for a while, left MPs in the Labour Party have been campaigning for a while. And it, again, can be traced back to the work of academics and thinkers, people like Thomas Piketty, for example, who were writing about inequality a long time ago. So it's become like a really defining political economic issue, this idea of wealth taxation. And Reeves knows that, which is why she's kind of like gestured towards doing something on this by saying, look, I'm going to make, people who have very, very valuable homes pay a little bit more tax. But it's not really a wealth tax. It's a small change to council taxation. And the other change we have, which is taxing income from wealth, so things like dividends, which you get if you own shares, or landlord's income, which you have if you own rental properties. That literally just aligns that with rates of income tax from work. So this is something that people have, from all of across the political spectrum, been demanding for a very long time. So it's relatively minor in that sense. It's not going to raise that much money. I think I read that the mansion tax was around 450 million versus 8 billion for the freezing of income tax thresholds, which is a really, really significant increase. So yeah, there's obviously like gesturing towards the need to tackle inequality. But this budget isn't really going to do very much to tackle inequality. And, part of this is an issue that I wrote about in my Substack piece on the budget, which is that you can't just target inequality using the tax system, because wealthy people have ways to get around taxes. This is something we've known for a very long time. And also, if you just allow people to become incredibly rich and then think that's not going to have any impact on politics or democracy, you're deluding yourself. Like, if we have high levels of inequality, it means rich people get to basically make the rules. And that's kind of the issue that we're seeing right now, because so much of this budget has been influenced, not just by the left, although it has been influenced by the left, but also by vested interests that have said you can't do this and you can't do that. And Reeves feels like, well, I've got to listen to these people because, they pay the bills, they, donate, and they're rich and powerful.
Again, I want to touch on so much of what you said there. But first, I guess this budget has been accused of sort of squeezing the middle. That's like a lot of the language we're seeing in the media. But I wondered if you thought that perhaps graduates are some of the biggest losers from this budget, because not only have they seen their income tax thresholds frozen, but also we saw the student loan interest and repayments threshold frozen as well. So I wondered if that was something you would agree with.
Yeah, definitely. I mean, if we think about the households on the lower end of the income spectrum that are going to be most affected by these changes, it's people who weren't previously paying income tax and are now being brought into paying income tax altogether. So obviously you have the personal allowance up to £12,500, before which you don't pay any income tax. And now there are going to be people who would previously, if the tax rates had been adjusted for inflation, been kept out of paying tax, and who are now going to be paying sometimes significant sums in extra tax. A few £100s a year, that doesn't sound like very much, but for someone earning £13,000, that is a huge amount of money. Yes, that's going to affect students, right? Because this is obviously going to affect significantly people in part-time work. They're already squeezed between rising costs, rising bills, rising rents, which in some cities are becoming completely intolerable, and these changes to income taxation. But it's also going to affect very poor families and households who are, who are supporting themselves on these kinds of salaries full time. Now, it's easy to dismiss this idea that anyone could possibly be earning, 12,000, 13, 14,000 pounds and surviving. But this is a reality for some people, right? Like, there are households that are earning very, very low amounts of money in some areas of the country. And again, less likely to be in London, but perhaps in the regions, and who are really struggling to get by. Again, because of the cost of living crisis, because of, these changes to taxation, because of rising energy bills, because of generalized inflation, but which inflation is affecting their wages less than the costs that they're facing, because they don't have that kind of power as workers to be able to demand wage increases in line with inflation as some other people higher up the income spectrum. So those people are going to be really significantly affected by this as well. And I think it's really important to remember that, the left is often characterized as just the side that wants more taxes on everyone because that's, apparently the way that we think we're going to reduce inequality. But actually, we shouldn't be taxing the poor to pay for handouts for the rich. And that's actually what our government does. We've seen this government is still committing to maintaining massive amounts of subsidies to the fossil fuel companies. We're talking billions every year in subsidies to the fossil fuel companies, not to mention, spending tons of money on defense, much of which ends up enriching shareholders of companies like BAE Systems. So the question isn't really, just about how much are we taxing and how much are we spending. It's who are we taxing and what are we using that money for? And at the moment, there seems to be this kind of regressive shift of taxing less well-off people to pay for often handouts for the rich, defense spending, stuff that we could really do without.
Why isn't Rachel Reeves considering something like a windfall tax on big banks' profits, or taxing industries like finance or big tech, which is overwhelmingly a popular thing to do with the British public?
The answer to that question is very simple, and it is lobbying. So, it's very easy to make an argument for, let's say, a windfall tax on the finance sector or a sector that's, fossil fuel companies, which we do actually have now, the windfall tax, as a result of, that really big push to introduce somewhat more progressive policies during the cost of living crisis. But the reason that that hasn't spread to more sectors is that there is this extremely powerful apparatus of lobbying firms, comms agencies, powerful firms that have the ear of this government, and they're able to influence the decisions that are being made by Rachel Reeves and others much more effectively than other interest groups that represent, the wants and needs of ordinary people. One of the most interesting examples of this kind of process of lobbying and how it influences political decision making, I looked at in my book, Vulture Capitalism. And our former Prime Minister, David Cameron, when he left office, ended up becoming a lobbyist for a firm called Greensill Capital, which was basically a kind of, shadow bank type institution. And Greensill got into trouble during the pandemic and it needed a loan. So David Cameron swung into action and started firing off text messages to the Treasury, to the Bank of England, to lots of different people saying, you need to give Greensill a loan. And he had some pushback because Greensill was not the type of company that should have been receiving a loan. And eventually it did get a loan, thanks to David Cameron basically knocking on doors and saying, you need to give money to this firm. You need to give corporate welfare to this firm for which I'm a lobbyist. At the same time, you had people losing their homes, doctors and nurses being subject to kind of, horrendous conditions at work. You had people losing their jobs. None of those people were able to knock on the door of the Prime Minister or the Chancellor and say, we need support. And I think that really demonstrates the issue that we have here, which is that the state is very porous for some. It's very easy for some people to get a meeting with Rachel Reeves. If you're the CBI or a representative of a big bank or a fossil fuel company, there's recent research showing that the fossil fuel companies had 500 meetings with the Labour Party in recent years. So obviously they were using those meetings to push for what they wanted. But if you're a doctor or a nurse or a carer or a student or really anyone else, you can't do that. You don't have the same capacity to influence their decisions, which is why it's so important to really organize to push for these changes. It's not enough just to say, we need a wealth tax or we need a windfall tax and then outline an intellectual argument as to why that would work. Politicians only act when they're scared. And right now, the only reason we've had any, movement on the wealth tax, the only reason that they haven't gotten rid of the windfall tax on the energy giants is that they're a bit scared. They're a little bit scared of losing votes to their left, as well as, to be fair, losing votes to their right. But they know that losing votes to the left is much more of an existential problem. So, if we want progressive change, we've got to get organised and push for it and make those politicians as scared of ordinary people as they are of the people writing the checks.
And I think in this budget, we really saw that around the gambling levy, which I think in the end didn't raise as much as it potentially could have because of the absolute lobbying efforts that were put in by gambling companies and the representatives. But you said earlier that just tweaks to the tax system can address the wealth inequality, the growing inequality that we see in the UK. And I was wondering, how do you address it if it's not through tweaking the tax system?
So there are lots of measures that you can do that don't involve taxation and spending that can, get to the root of inequality. One of those is things like salary caps, for example, and regulating pay to make sure some people aren't taking home vast amounts of money. But I think the biggest thing is really tackling issues around ownership. Because the reason that we have wealth inequality in this country is that a very small number of people owns all the stuff that is needed to live and to produce things. And they generate vast amounts of income from their ownership of that stuff. So if we want a fairer and more equal economy, we need to be pushing for more equal, equitable models of ownership. We could see this in the housing market, for example. We need less private landlordism and much more social housing. That would actually go some way to reducing wealth inequality because landlords are more likely to be extremely rich and often they're able to kind of hide the income that they're generating from their assets and keep it outside of the tax system. So changing that would be one thing. Public ownership of our most important utilities would be another really important thing, not just because you're kind of, denying income to those shareholders, many of whom are very wealthy, but also because you then have strategic control over utilities like water, energy, etc., which means you're able to make decisions about them that align with our climate goals, but which also potentially push down bills for citizens, particularly those who are the poorest. So, those changes to like the structure of the economy, to who owns what, are really, really important. And they're important because they kind of create a brake on the constant acceleration of wealth and power that you see when a small number of people own everything. This is really what Piketty was writing about when he wrote about inequality, this idea that when the returns to wealth exceed the returns to labor, basically, you are going to get inevitably increasing wealth inequality. And you need to be able to put a brake on that because otherwise the wealthy and powerful translate their economic power into political power, which is exactly what they're doing right now. That's what it means to say, we don't have a tax on big finance because of lobbying. The reason for that is that wealthy people have been able to translate their economic power into political power and insulate themselves really from democratic accountability. And that is how kind of government works under capitalism, unless there's a powerful popular force capable of pushing back against those vested interests, which is why, the political side of this is just as important as the economic side of it, right? The policies themselves are important, but so are the movements that are pushing for those policies.
Because of the sort of system that you've just outlined there, does that mean that Rachel Reeves's sort of fundamental belief that growth is going to solve all of the UK's problems, does that mean that's fundamentally misguided?
The whole growth is going to save us thing is a fascinating kind of self delusion that comes from basically a misreading of history. So if you look at New Labour, which is basically the inspiration for Starmerism, it's the inspiration for anyone kind of in the centre of the Labour Party, anyone who's in charge right now. They want to be the next kind of Blair, right? And for Blair, the idea was you don't need to do that much redistribution. You just need to ride the wave of growth and tax some of the gains that the rich are generating in order to alleviate some of the poverty left over from the destruction of, working class communities under Thatcherism. So it was a kind of take a little bit from the rich and give a little bit to those who are less well off and just let economic growth pull everyone up year by year by year. And there were also kind of specific elements to that, right? Which was, the privatization of social housing and just a general increase in home ownership meant that lots of people felt themselves getting wealthier, even people lower down the income spectrum. So they were less likely to pay attention to, issues like how effective public services are working and, what taxes the richest are paying and that sort of stuff. And that whole model was based on a massive financial bubble which is what secured those kind of underlying rates of growth that allowed that non-particularly redistributive model to work. And it blew up in 2008. And ever since then, the centre, Liberals, have been desperately searching around, trying to figure out how they can get back to those times where they didn't have to take too much from the rich to support the living standards of the poor because they could just rely on constant economic growth. And of course, they can't do that now. The housing bubble is over. Sure, we're in the middle of a new bubble, but it's a bubble in assets that most people don't hold. The housing bubble meant that like lots of people got wealthier because lots of people were able to buy houses. The AI bubble is literally just extracting wealth from those at the bottom to those at the top. And this is, just exactly everything that's happened in our economy since 2008 has aligned with that kind of extractive economic model where even if you do get economic growth, it's not benefiting those at the bottom. It's mostly benefiting those at the top. And at the same time, we don't have an efficient and effective enough tax system to be able to capture that and redistribute it. So that's the fundamental problem for someone like Rachel Reeves, is that her vision of the world that she wants to create is just fundamentally defunct. It is based on a misreading of history, and it's not going to happen again. So she needs to kind of get real and realize that we're not going to have astronomical rates of growth driven by some new amazing technological innovation that's going to somehow make everyone feel better off. And actually, hard decisions do need to be made about who gets what, about who is going to have to pay and who is going to be supported. And at the moment, we are seeing basically the less well off paying to support those at the top. And we need to flip that around and start seriously attacking the vested interests and privileges of the very wealthiest in our society, and instead focusing on supporting everyone else who makes the economy run.
And we heard a lot in Reeves's budget as well about AI and AI companies and attracting AI to the UK and building more data centers here. But I guess kind of like you're saying, well, if that wealth is just being extracted out of the UK, then will it actually deliver any of the things that Rachel Reeves seems to be banking on it delivering? But I wondered, we've spoken a bit earlier about the Greens and their sort of their influence and what they might gain from this budget. But I wondered if what you think this budget's effects will have on people who are considering voting reform, especially in sort of former Labour strongholds where we have some of the most deprived communities in the UK.
I actually don't think this budget is really going to have any impact on the vast majority of people's decisions when it comes to who they're voting for. And the reason for that is that I think a lot of people in this election are voting out of a deep sense of rage at an unaccountable and entitled political establishment that has abandoned them, not just at this budget, not just at the last budget, but really for the last like 10 years or maybe even 20 or 30 years. And they've just had enough. It doesn't matter if Rachel Reeves says she's going to marginally increase, I don't know, the top rate of tax, or marginally increase taxes on wealth, or even if she was to say that she was going to kind of invest more in public services and actually try and do something to support the living standards of those at the bottom. I don't think it would make a difference because people do not trust politicians. Trust in democracy is at all-time lows. There was a study that was done last year before the rise of the Greens and Reform, which said that only 12% of people in the country trusted any political party. The levels of trust are so low. The levels of rage that people feel towards a political class that has completely and utterly abandoned them are so high that the Tories and Labour are never going to be able to win back the votes that they've lost. And nor should they, because they don't deserve to. They haven't tried. They haven't earned back that trust. They haven't demonstrated that they're willing to listen to the concerns of ordinary people. And, as a result, our politics is going to start looking a lot more chaotic. We have an electoral system that's built for two main political parties. Even the structure of the chamber of the House of Commons is built for two parties facing off against each other. And that is increasingly going to be a thing of the past. We're going to see a much more fractured electoral system. And with that comes a real opportunity for ordinary people who have been really shut out of democracy as a result of the way our electoral system works, as a result of lobbying, as a result of kind of political capture, to start pushing all of these parties in a more progressive direction. So, I think politics is actually going to get very interesting and very exciting again for those who want to see just real fundamental change to the way our economy works.
Finally, this question might seem a little bit reductive now we've spoken about the sort of more fundamental changes that need to happen within the economy, aside from just tweaking tweaking the tax system. But if there was one policy that you could, if you were Chancellor, that you could have put in that budget, what would it have been?
I think one of the most important things that we need to be thinking about is how to expand the scope and size of the labor movement. This is one of those structural reforms which would really kind of potentially permanently redistribute wealth and power from those at the top to those at the bottom. It's one of those things that you can't easily reverse. It's not like you can just kind of cut funding one year and then shut the whole thing down. It would instead revolve a suite of legislative changes to change the way that people think about organizing at work, to change the relationship between employers and unions, and to make it a lot easier and a lot more effective to be able to bargain with your employer over wages, yes, but over conditions and so many other things. That would not just have a lasting impact on people's economic situation, it would transform our politics, much as it did in the early part of the 20th century when people suddenly realized, oh, wait, I can be part of a political movement that can actually not just like win stuff for me, but that can actually change the face of the country. And, if you had those strong, powerful unions that really represented a diverse array of people and which were internally democratic, they would also be able to go into state institutions and push back against the fossil fuel companies, push back against the finance sector, and really start advocating for working people within our democratic institutions. So, yeah, I think just strengthening worker power would be number one on my list. So moving towards like sectoral collective bargaining, getting rid of the anti-trade union legislation, and just educating people about unions and what they can achieve. That would be number one on my list.
Grace Blakeley, thank you so much for joining us on Politics, Joe.
Thank you for having me.